The moment a man begins to understand himself, truly understand himself, everything changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, subtly, deeply. Because most of his life, he has been moving without awareness, reacting instead of choosing, rushing instead of feeling, following patterns that were never designed consciously, but simply repeated until they became automatic. And nowhere is that more visible than in the way he experiences pleasure. What he believes is natural is often just conditioned. What he believes is normal is often just practiced. Fast, mechanical, predictable. A quick build up followed by a quick end, and then nothing. A brief moment of intensity followed by a sense of emptiness he doesn't fully understand. So he repeats it again and again, not because it satisfies him, but because it's familiar. But a mature man begins to notice something others ignore. He begins to feel that something is missing. Not more stimulation, but more depth. Not more intensity, but more awareness. Because he starts to realize that pleasure is not something you chasey. It's something you expand, and expansion requires time. It requires presence. It requires a willingness to slow down in a world that constantly teaches you to move faster. Because speed is easy. Speed hides everything. It hides your lack of control. It hides your lack of awareness. It hides your disconnection from your own body. But when you slow down, those things become visible. And that's where growth begins. At first, it feels unfamiliar. Your body resists. Your mind wanders. There is an urge, a strong, almost automatic urge to go back to what feels comfortable, to rush, to finish, to escape. But if you stay, if you resist that urge just for a moment longer than usual, something begins to shift. You start to feel differently. Not just more, but deeper, more connected, more present. You begin to notice the space between sensations, the subtle rise instead of the sudden spike. The way you're breathing changes everything. Because breath is not just a function of survival. It is a tool of control. Shallow breathing creates tension. Tension creates urgency. Urgency creates loss of control. But slow, deep breathing, it grounds you. It centers you. It brings you back into your body. And when you are truly in your body, you are no longer reacting blindly. You are aware, you are choosing, and choice is where maturity begins. A mature man does not fight his impulses, he understands them. He observes them, he learns their patterns. He recognizes the exact moment when sensation begins to build, not when it's already overwhelming, but when it's still subtle. And in that subtlety, he has control. Because control is not something you apply at the peak, it's something you build from the beginning. It's in the pace, the rhythm, the awareness. The decision to stay below the edge instead of constantly pushing past it. And when you learn to stay there, just below that edgy, something powerful happens. Time expands, moments stretch. What used to last seconds now lasts minutes. What used to feel sharp and brief now feels deep and sustained. Because you are no longer chasing the end. You are living inside the experience itself. And that changes everything. Because when you remove the need to finish quickly, you remove the pressure. And when pressure disappears, so does anxiety, so does tension. So does the constant need to perform. Even in your own private space, you begin to relax, and relaxation is where true sensitivity returns, because tension dulls sensation, but relaxation amplifies it. A relaxed body feels more. A present mind experiences more, and a controlled pace allows more to unfold. This is why a mature man experiences pleasure differently, not because his body is different, but because his awareness is. He is not rushing, he is not escaping into fantasy or urgency. He is here, fully here, feeling every shift, every rise, every subtle change in sensation. And because of that awareness, he gains something most men never develop: consistency. Control that is not forced, but natural, effortless. Because he is not trying to stop something at the last moment. He is guiding it from the beginning. And that guidance creates a completely different experience. One that is not exhausting, but energizing. One that does not leave him empty, but grounded. One that does not disconnect him, but brings him closer to himself. And over time, this changes more than just the experience itself. It changes his identity. Because when a man learns to control his impulses in moments of intensity, he begins to trust himself more. He knows he is not controlled by urges. He knows he is not driven by habit. He knows he can pause even when everything inside him wants to rush. And that kind of self-trust, it extends into every area of life. Decisions become clearer. Reactions become calmer. Presence becomes stronger. Because he has trained himself in one of the most instinct-driven areas to stay aware instead of reactive. And that is rare. Most people never develop that level of awareness. They live in reaction, in habit, in repetition. But a mature man, he evolves beyond that, not by force, but by understanding. He doesn't suppress his nature. He refines it. He slows it down. He brings awareness into it. And in doing so, he transforms it from something automatic into something intentional, from something rushed into something deep, from something empty into something meaningful. And once that transformation happens, there is no going back, because you realize how much you were missing before. How much depth exists when you stop chasing speed? How much control exists when you stop reacting automatically? How much satisfaction exists when you stay present instead of rushing to the end? And that realization, it stays with you. It becomes part of how you live. Because once you learn to slow down in one area, you begin to slow down everywhere. You listen more, you observe more, you react less, you choose more. And life itself begins to feel different, richer, deeper, more controlled, more intentional, all because you made one simple shift. You stopped chasing quick pleasure. and started building deep connection. And when you stay on that path long enough, something even more subtle begins to reveal itself, something that goes beyond technique, beyond control, beyond even the idea of pleasure itself. You begin to understand your own energy, not in a mystical or abstract way, but in a very real, physical, undeniable sense. You notice that when you rush, you lose it quickly. When you chase the peak without awareness, everything builds fast and disappears just as fast. But when you slow down, when you stay present, when you breathe and allow, instead of forcing, that same energy doesn't disappear. It circulates. It expands. It stays with you. And this is where the real shift begins, because now it's no longer about a moment of release. It's about sustaining a state of awareness, a state of control, a state where you are fully connected to your body without being overwhelmed by it. Most men have never experienced that state. They've only experienced spikes, short bursts, followed by a drop, so they think that's all there is. But a mature man begins to explore what happens between those spikes. He becomes curious about the space most people ignore. He starts to ask himself, what if I don't rush past this? What if I stay here a little longer? What if I don't give in to the first urge to speed up? And those small questions lead to powerful discoveries. Because the moment you stop reacting automatically, you create space. And in that space, you gain control, not by force, but by awareness. You begin to recognize the exact moment your body wants to accelerate, the exact point where habit tries to take over. And instead of following it, you pause, you breathe, you soften. And that pause, of that simple moment of awareness, breaks the entire pattern. Because habits rely on continuity, they need you to keep going without thinking. But awareness interrupts that. Awareness gives you a choice. And every time you choose differently, you weaken the old pattern, you create a new one, a slower one, a deeper one, a more controlled one. And over time, that new pattern becomes your default. You no longer have to remind yourself to slow down. You naturally move with more awareness, with more intention, with more presence. And this presence begins to affect not just what you feel, but how you feel. Because there is a difference between intensity and depth. Intensity is loud, fast, overwhelming, it demands attention. But it doesn't last. Depth is quiet, steady, expansive, it doesn't demand anything, it unfolds. And the more present you are, the more you begin to prefer depth over intensity. Because depth satisfies in a way intensity never can. Intensity excites you, depth fulfills you. And fulfillment is what most men are actually searching for, even if they don't realize it. They think they want more intensity, more stimulation, more speed. But what they're really missing is connection. Connection to themselves, connection to the moment, connection to something that feels real, not rushed. And that connection only becomes possible when you slow down enough to feel it. Because you cannot connect to something you are rushing through. You cannot understand something you never stay with. You cannot master something you only experience on the surface. So a mature man goes deeper, not out of necessity, but out of awareness. He begins to explore his own responses. He notices how small changes create different outcomes, how a slight shift in pace changes everything, how breathing can either calm or intensify the entire experience, how relaxation opens doors that tension keeps closed. And through that exploration, he gains knowledge. Not theoretical knowledge, but lived understanding. The kind of understanding that cannot be taught, only experienced. And once you have that understanding, you stop looking for shortcuts. Because you realize the shortcuts are what kept you stuck in the first place, you start valuing the process, the build-up, the gradual unfolding of sensation. Because you know that's where the real experience is. Not at the end, but in everything leading up to it. And something interesting happens when you shift your focus like that. The need to finish quickly begins to fade. Not because you're forcing yourself to hold back, but because you're no longer in a hurry. You're not chasing an endpoint anymore. You're engaged in the experience itself. And when the experience becomes enough, the urgency disappears. That's when control becomes effortless. Because you're not fighting yourself. You're not resisting anything. You're simply choosing to stay, to remain present, to continue exploring instead of ending it prematurely. And this ability to stay what carries power. Because most people cannot stay. They need constant change, constant stimulation, constant movement. They are uncomfortable with stillness, uncomfortable with presence, uncomfortable with being fully aware without distraction. But a mature man becomes comfortable there, in stillness, in awareness, in control. And that comfort gives him an advantage not just in private moments, but in life itself. Because life constantly tests your ability to stay present under pressure, to remain calm when things intensify, to think clearly when emotions rise. And if you've trained yourself to handle intensity without losing control, you carry that strength everywhere. You become less reactive, less impulsive, more grounded, more deliberate. Because you've learned something most people avoid learning: how to be in control when it matters most. And that control is not rigid. It's not forced. It's fluid. It adapts, it responds, it moves with awareness instead of against it. And that's why it feels natural. Because it is natural once you remove the habits that were covering it, once you remove the rush, the distraction, the unconscious repetition. What's left is your natural state, which is awareness, which is presence, which is control. And from that state, everything becomes richer, more detailed, more meaningful. Because you're actually experiencing it, not just passing through it. And over time, this becomes your standard. You no longer settle for shallow experiences. You no longer rush through moments. You no longer disconnect from yourself, because you've seen what's possible when you stay present, when you go deeper, when you choose awareness over habit. And that choice repeated over time becomes who you are. A man who is not controlled by impulses, but guided by awareness. A man who does not rush through life, but moves through it with intention. A man who understands that real satisfaction is not found in speed, but in depth, not in intensity alone, but in connection. And once you reach that level of understanding, you realize that the secret was never hidden. It was simply ignored in favor of speed, ignored in favor of convenience, ignored in favor of habit. But now you see it clearly, that everything changes the moment you slow down, the moment you pay attention, the moment you stop chasing the end and start living in the experience. Because that is where the real power is, not in what happens at the finish, but in everything you feel along the way. And when you truly understand that, you stop looking for more and start experiencing more with what was already there all along.